John 3:29. Qui habet sponsam sponsus est, amicus autem sponsi, qui stat et audit eum, gaudio gaudet, propter vocem sponsi. Hoc ergo gaudium meum impletum est. He who has the bride is the bridegroom, and or but the friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices with joy on account of the voice of the bridegroom. This joy of mine, therefore, has been filled up to the full, or has been made complete. John is winding up his response to his disciples here, who are wondering kind of about the respective statuses of John, who's baptizing in this given area, and Jesus, who with his disciples is baptizing in the same area. And so he goes on and builds on what he's previously said, and he uses here a metaphor from weddings. And so we learned some handy-dandy Latin wedding vocabulary while we're at it. Why not, right? You can see these are all related words here. Sponsa, that's a first declension feminine word, of course, for obvious reasons. This one, sponsus, is a second declension masculine noun. He who, remember, we don't have to have the antecedent expressed in Latin. We don't need an is. It's not necessary. We can supply it from context. He who has or possesses the sponsa, the bride, that is a betrothed woman, is the sponsus, the bridegroom. We don't really use this word very often in English anymore for betrothed man, but we also don't have a better one, so sometimes you'll still hear it at weddings. Usually groom, we shorten it to in modern English rather than bridegroom. I can't remember the last time I was at a wedding and I heard somebody referred to as the bridegroom. Usually we just say groom. Isn't it interesting though? Sponsa and sponsus, you can hear the relation between those two words is sort of programmed in, so to speak, by their betrothal to one another. But we've eliminated that for contrast in English. We say bride and groom, as though to make the contrast between them sort of as great as possible. That is to sort of disambiguate between them. But in Latin, that's not an issue, and you can hear the etymological relationship between them, which, if you ask me, sort of seems a little more fitting because of what we're talking about here, marriage, or an impending marriage. The sponsus is the guy who has the sponsa, and here we would probably stick a semicolon if we were punctuating this as in an English text. Amicus, don't be misled, by the way, by phrases like what you hear in English in a legal context. Amicus brief, that's American English, not Latin. The word in Latin is amicus with a long I and an accent on the middle syllable there. Amicus autem. Now this could be an adversative, a true adversative particle, but the amicus, or it could just be elaborating and so forth. But it's nice to take it as an adversative here because there is a contrast, right? What John is trying to tell us is Christ is the sponsus, but John, he himself, that is the amicus sponsi. Here we've got, just delayed a little bit, sponsi, genitive, singular, masculine, the friend of the bridegroom, who stands there, or who waits, we might even translate freely, and hears him. Some English translations say listens for him, and then hears him coming. That is the picture that John is developing for us here. Is it's just before a wedding is about to happen, and the friend of the bridegroom who's helping to facilitate all this, he hears at last that the bridegroom is on his way. In ancient weddings, it was the arrival of the bridegroom that was really the most important and exciting part. In modern North American weddings, of course, it's a little bit different. And in European weddings, it's usually the arrival of the bride. That's kind of the big, exciting focus. But here the bridegroom is playing the leading role. So when he arrives, things are about to get started. And as a result, naturally, what does the amicus do? He gaudet gaudio. This is kind of a funny and admittedly sort of awkward repetition by classical stylistic standards. But who cares? We're not in the classical era anymore. And our main priority of our translator here, which was Jerome, and this is just worth pointing out often when we're talking about the Gospels, which we know Jerome himself worked on, even though probably later hands touched up the translation here or there after him. He's striving to be very close to the Greek, as close as possible. And if he didn't see a compelling reason to change what was in the older Latin versions, he generally didn't. His practice, there are some exceptions, but his practice generally was pretty conservative on the whole. So he liked to preserve that older wording. And here he probably maybe experienced the temptation to say, maybe I should make this, more elegant and stylistically appropriate by the canons of classical style and use a different word other than gaudium here, because we get kind of this etymological jangling or repetition, which sometimes is pleasant in poetry, but in prose here, just kind of nakedly beside one another. Perhaps it jars the ear, but this is the sort of thing that Jerome just left in from those older Latin translations because he didn't want to change anything that didn't need changing. So here it is. Gaudio gaudat. He rejoices with joy. Easy to understand. And in case you're wondering, we could call this like an ablative of cause, I suppose. He rejoices on account of his joy, something like that. But if you understand it, you don't need to worry too much about what to call it. That's my general rule for my students. It's good to know what to name things, but it's not the most important thing. Propter vocem sponsi, on account of the voice of the bridegroom. That gives the reason for why he's happy. Now, again, we kind of need a break in the sentence here. So John is finished with his metaphor, and he's drawing the moral now, which is hoc ergo gaudium meum. This, therefore, joy of mine, this my joy, impletum est. Third person singular, perfect passive indicative. It has been filled up to the brim, like a cup about to overflow.